Good morning, everybody. Why don't we get started here? This is the GIPS Compliance and Developments breakout session. And just to show you, the IA listens. Last year, GIPS was part of the social media and advertisement session, and it was all about GIPS. And the comments came back as though it should be a GIPS session, and so they listened, and here we are. And just a housekeeping issue, questions. You can put questions through the app. You can do it, raise your hand, and there are cards in the back. You can write your questions down. Or really what we encourage you to do, just raise your hand and ask the question, and hopefully we'll have a lot of conversation among the group. And when we come out here, we'll come out a lot smarter, and we'll learn more about GIPS. Now, let's talk about the panel. I'm Michael Cassis. I'm a partner in the law firm K&L Gates. I'm also chairman of the firm and head of the investment management practice group. And my relationship with GIPS, I was the general counsel of the CFA Institute, then AIMER, from 1993 to 2001, and one of my primary responsibilities was the development, interpretation, and the promotion of AIMER PPS and then GIPS around the world. At that time, that's where I met Karen Vincent. Karen Vincent at that time was head of the, at PwC, of their performance group, their global performance group. And from that, she left PwC. She opened up her own firm, Vincent, what is it?
Vincent Performance.
Vincent Performance, and very successful. Many of you probably used her. And then she sold her firm to ACA, and now she's on the beach. Very relaxed. So you can be very successful in this area. Then to Karen's immediate left is Grace Mann. Grace is senior manager at Franklin Templeton, works out of the San Mateo office. She's head of all the GIPS composites, all the GIPS issues that come up with a global firm of Franklin Templeton size. Most of her focus is on the U.S., but she also deals with a lot of the international issues. And she also worked at Callan Associates, so she comes with very much from a consultant's view. And to her immediate left is Jonathan Boersman. Many of you knew Jonathan Boersman. Jonathan has been here many times. He's always been a major speaker on GIPS issues. Jonathan now is CEO of Basis Point Solutions, a consulting firm. And before that, for many, many years, over a decade, he was head of, basically, director of all the standards at the CFA Institute, and one of his primary responsibility really was overseeing GIPS, its interpretations, all the committees. So if you have a problem with GIPS, he's the guy you talk to, and you blame.
Blame me.
So I like the idea. You create this standard, you create these confusions, then you create your consulting firm to help people out. Right?
You do the math.
So, okay. With the panel, what we're going to do, we're going to start out. Karen's going to start giving us an overview of some of the changes occurring in GIPS, the guidance statements. There's some controversial one. There's also going to be a major change in GIPS in 2020. So she's going to give us a background for that. The other panelists will jump in. We will ask questions, and also while she or any of us are talking, raise your hand, ask the question. We will try to answer it. If we can't answer it, Jonathan will. All right, Karen, you want to start?
Sure. So I'm going to cover, as Mike said, some of the highlights from GIPS 2020, and then going to cover some of the technical issues that are going on right now, and review some of the technical projects. So next slide, please. So GIPS 2020. So the GIPS standards that we all currently use now were created in 2010 with an effective date of January 1st, 2011. So it's time to update the standards again. So the process to create the next edition, which we're referring to as GIPS 2020, is well underway. And as part of that process, earlier last year, a consultation paper was issued to try to solicit feedback on some of the key issues to make sure that we were heading in the right direction. So that whole process started. We got about 60 or 70 comment letters, and the responses on those issues has certainly impacted the way and the direction that we are heading. Next slide. So I'm going to review right now some of the key concepts that are embedded in GIPS 2020 right now and are expected to be there. This is all, of course, note the heading subject to change until we get to the point where it's time to issue them. Anything is subject to change. So one of the key concepts is that we are going to better differentiate selling a composite strategy versus a pooled fund strategy. And so right now, the GIPS standards are all focused on composites, but we recognize that you can also sell participation in a specific fund, and so we're going to have different guidance for selling participation in what we would refer to as probably a private fund. In the GIPS speak, it's currently being called a limited distribution pooled fund, and that is in contrast to what we would call retail funds, and in GIPS speak is referred to as a broadly distributed pooled fund. So we're going to have different guidance for better saying what are you selling. Right now, there are no big changes expected to the current composite construction requirements in the GIPS standards, making sure that a composite includes all portfolios managed in a specific strategy. But there is going to be one big change, which is going to acknowledge that if you have a specific pooled fund and all you're doing is selling participation in that fund, that you don't have to go through the fake process of creating a composite to hold that fund if you're not going to be selling that as a composite strategy. So again, we're going to be better differentiating fund strategies versus composite strategies. Right now, there's no goal of changing the approach for how we're handling broadly distributed pooled funds. I'm going to come back and talk about that subject a little bit later in a bit more detail. Right now, in the GIPS standards, you're pretty much, in most cases, allowed to calculate returns that are either gross or net of fees. But those fees are only two kinds. It's either transaction costs and investment management fees. The goal, though, is to have the performance of funds, and that would be both limited distribution and prod distribution, require those returns be net of all fees and expenses, not just investment management fees and transaction costs. So that would include administrative costs as well.
Just clarification that when you say administrative costs, would that also be costs of your custodian, of your administrator, or just entities that would be related to the manager?
Costs embedded within the fund. So it's any costs that an investor would pay. Yep. So we also expect to expand the use of money-weighted returns versus time-weighted returns. Right now, there's very limited ability to use only money-weighted returns. And if the manager controls the cash flows and meets at least one other criteria, like it's fixed life, fixed commitment, you'll be able to choose to use money-weighted return instead of time-weighted return. Another concept we're hoping to include is to require more timely updating of compliant presentations. Right now, there's nothing that requires you to include current returns in your GIPS reports. So we want to not have firms be able to say, oh, our performance is 3 years old, but we still meet the requirement to provide, the required information. So we're going to have some requirements around that. So the goal is to issue the exposure draft of GIPS 2020 on August 31st. When we hope to have a 4-month comment period. We're also going to bifurcate the verification guidance. So right now within the GIPS standards, there's guidance for verifiers who conduct verifications for compliance with the GIPS standards. It's difficult to write that guidance about and update it for changes in the procedures when the provisions themselves are being updated. So we're going to probably have a 2-month lag on the verification guidance. So we're going to issue the GIPS standards August 31st, and then hopefully 2 months after that, issue the guidance applicable to verifiers to give us time to get that guidance finalized based on the final exposure draft. And the expected effective date of all of this is January 1st, 2020. So a couple highlights now on some of the guidance statements that were out for public comment. The first one is supplemental information. There's this concept of supplemental information, which says that that's any information that goes beyond what is required or recommended by the GIPS standards. It has to be classified or labeled as supplemental information. A good example that we see a lot is pure gross returns for wrap managers, where those returns don't reflect the deduction of transaction costs. So any information in the supplemental that's called supplemental has to be related directly to the composite, and it also cannot be false or misleading, just like any other performance that a firm presents. Next, please. So one of the new requirements is it just goes on to say that it has to be clearly labeled and described. So you can't just say it's supplemental, you have to make sure that the information is described. That's not really too much of a stretch, I think. And there's also a new requirement that it not be shown with greater prominence than the required information. So you can't have your GIPS compliant information buried in a footnote in 5 font and then have your supplemental information in 50 font. So that's another proposed change. And it also clarifies that supplemental information is limited only to information within the GIPS report itself. It's not information that's outside the GIPS reporting structure. So if you've got a fact sheet and you have pure gross returns, let's say you thought that you could do that, but you don't mention GIPS, you don't have to label it as supplemental information anymore. Next.
So in that, so if you have, as you said, a fact sheet, you don't use the word GIPS, you basically don't have to comply with GIPS, similar to the advertising guidelines?
So if you don't mention the GIPS standards in a marketing piece, you don't have to comply with the requirements of the GIPS standards, except there is this one overarching requirement that if you claim compliance with the GIPS standards, you are prohibited from showing false or misleading performance in any performance information, and that extends beyond GIPS requirements. So, but I would argue that that's no different for any firm in the U.S. anyway, so we already have that requirement.
Okay.
Karen,
Yes.
if I have a pitch book and Appendix B is a GIPS compliant presentation, and I have composite returns, up in the main part of the pitch book, do I have to label those, or?
That's exactly when you don't have to label that information as supplemental information. There's been a lot of confusion. Firms have thought, given the contradictory guidance in the GIPS standards and some of the guidance, that they did have to label everything in a pitch book as supplemental information. And you can do that, but you're not required to. It's only in the GIPS report that you have to label something explicitly as supplemental information. But there is a new proposed requirement. And if you go to the next slide, which is if you do include a compliant presentation in that 200-page pitch book, and it's on page 99 or 199, you're going to be required to refer the reader to that compliant presentation. Because if you have a requirement to make every reasonable effort to provide a compliant presentation to all prospective clients, but you bury it in a 200-page document, have you really met that requirement? So all you're going to have to do is just put a reference and just say, see Appendix A or something like that. So I don't think that should be too burdensome. There's also some new requirements related to theoretical performance. If you include theoretical performance in a compliant presentation, a supplemental information, there are going to be some new required disclosures, just to explain pretty much what the information is and to make it clear that that is not performance based on actual assets. It's also proposed that those same disclosures be used whenever theoretical performance is presented, even outside of the GIPS information. But I think if you've read the draft and when you finally see the final version, you're not going to be surprised because the guidance is very similar to the current SEC requirements anyway. So at least for U.S. advisors, I don't think there should be any concern about that.
Karen, I get the question a lot when you have in a supplemental performance, when you present it, you have to refer them to the composite performance. Is it okay, people say, please go to our website and give the URL for that composite performance?
In the context of supplemental?
Content supplemental, and you have a deck. You have a deck you're marketing.
See, that's exactly what we're trying to clarify, is that if it's outside the GIPS information, it's not supplemental information. Some of the guidance has made it seem like you have to say something is supplemental even if it's outside the GIPS report, and we're trying to clarify to say that that's not really what we're intending. What we're intending is you only have to classify it as supplemental information within the GIPS information. So I think if somebody does that, I think that's great, because they're just pointing them to where they can get the GIPS information, but I'm not sure it's required.
Okay, excellent.
And so the goal is to get this document approved and issued in the not-too-distant future. It'll be at some point in 2018.
So just, I'm sorry, just to follow up on that point, and because this is fun, for me at least. So if I include it in the appendix, if I include the GIPS report as an appendix, I have to, in the main body of the presentation, refer back to it. But if I don't include it, I don't have to make any mention of it.
That's right. That's right. There's no requirement. There's no requirement to include GIPS information in any marketing materials, even if you claim compliance. What your obligation is to make every reasonable effort to provide a compliant presentation to all prospective clients. So you might include it in a pitch book. I think you should include it in a pitch book, because if you're meeting with a prospect, that's, it's an easy way to get that information to them. But you could provide it separately. You could provide it before you give a pitch book. So it's really, I think, up to you.
So in the U.S., so you could put any deck out there, not have to put any of the GIPS disclosures in it, and as long as the information is accurate, not misleading, same as the U.S. Advisors Act standard, and you include your composite in your ADV, you deliver it with your ADV, you're fine. Because you have to deliver an ADV when you sign up a new client.
If you deliver it, right,
Yeah.
right, mm-hmm, yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Although there's still the
That's-
requirement to provide a compliant presentation to every prospective client, right?
Yeah, that's what he
Okay.
just said, but he said, but you
So
would just do it.
I'm still, it seems a little backwards to me. And I wasn't involved in this particular
Wiping his hands. from it.
development.
You mean this guidance
But,
statement?
well, no, but I don't know, this clarification, or this proposal. But it seems that if you don't include it as an appendix, then you should be referring people to it, because it's not there. But to tell people that there's an appendix, I don't know, at least to me, that seems kind of counterintuitive. Like, by the way, there's more pages in this report. I don't know.
There's a question
Just seems kind of.
Yeah, I have a different question. So, because this is quite an issue for our firm, we are mostly high net worth individuals, but we're contemplating growing our business by expanding it institutional, which is why we're pursuing GIPS compliance. We're not compliant yet. And a big bone of contention in our firm is when you have to deliver that compliant presentation. Now, you said with the ADV, we don't deliver the ADV until they've signed the contract. So our understanding is that when an interested party becomes a prospect, whenever that is, and we have to figure that out, that's when we need to deliver GIPS.
That's right. That's right. So, right, because if you read the guidance, if you go to the GIPS handbook and you read the interpretation of provision 0A9, which is the provision that's on point here, it says that when somebody who's an interested party or somebody who, you're trying to pitch to becomes a prospective client is somebody who meets two qualifications. Number one, they're interested in a specific strategy, and number two, they qualify to invest in that strategy. So once they meet those two requirements, then you have every obligation, or you must make every reasonable effort to provide that compliant presentation to that prospect at that time.
But now there.
And not 12 months later. And not
Absolutely not 12 months later. That's right. That's right. So one of the things is the way the provision is written right now, which it's sort of a little confusing because of that 12 months. So we're clarifying that in GIPS 2020, is if you read the interpretation of that provision, it doesn't say that you get 12 months to provide that compliant presentation. It's when they qualify as a prospective client. That's when you have to get that GIPS information to them.
So is it up to our firm to define when an interested party becomes a prospect?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, so my, example I always give is, if you're out and every quarter you're out, knocking on the door of the Gates Foundation, you're trying to get them to hire you, and you're just throwing a bunch of marketing materials at them, and you're trying to get them to pay attention to you guys. And they just say, thank you very much, but we're not interested. And so you leave all sorts of marketing materials with them every quarter. But you don't know what they have not yet qualified as a prospective client because you don't know if they're interested in a specific strategy, and they haven't expressed interest, right? But when they finally say to you, okay, we're ready, we want to know what see your small cap history. At that point, you know what strategy they're interested in. It's the Gates Foundation, they qualify to invest in your strategy, so then at that point you have to get them that information.
Yeah, but Steve, for high net worth individuals, it's much more nebulous.
I know it is. I know it is. I
So,
know it is.
I think one very clear point is the point when they sign the agreement, they are no longer a prospect. They are an actual client.
Right.
So
That's
you've
too
missed
late.
your window at
That's
that
right.
point.
That's right.
So it needs to be before that.
So generally,
Unless they really only convert from interested party to prospect 5 minutes before the sign.
Yeah.
There's a question over here, too.
And I think high net worth, it's a lot grayer. So, it's not so clear
sure.
sometimes.
At this point, I have two questions/issues. One, the point you made about delivering the GCP at the time that you provide the ADV. At that point, you're too late, again. I mean, so.
If you're delivering the ADV after, yes,
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you're generally not delivering the ADV, though, at a point where somebody's identified as a prospect, as was just described. So at some point later in the transaction, you're again still too late. But to get on to my second question, I guess has there been consideration from the technical committee to actually put more of a requirement around this, similar to from an SEC perspective, for a prospectus delivery, or at least to have something on there that, as in your example where you're describing, you're throwing all kinds of marketing material at a prospect, and as we know that while GIPS has a higher adoption rate in the U.S., it's not adopted wonderfully globally. And there's probably a fair number of institutional clients who don't know how to get more information. And why wouldn't you want to include, at the very least, for more information, ask for this, for your GIPS compliant presentation?
Yeah, so we are, one of the ideas in the guidance statement is to allow more flexibility for a firm to offer to provide GIPS information, even if they don't follow the GIPS advertising guidelines.
Well, I'm actually saying going past flexibility and saying you need to do it. That if you want to be GIPS compliant, then you need to actually, be prepared and offer it in any of your materials, because that's part of being GIPS compliant is having that content ready and available.
I like the way he thinks.
I was going to say, I know. I was going to say, I think that this is why these documents go up for public comment. And I would love to see that. Absolutely love it. So, but that
I'm
doesn't.
just wondering if GIPS is trying to be too accommodating.
I never heard anybody saying GIPS is accommodating.
So, yeah, I think part of the challenge is that, when you write these rules, we're not writing them just for this market. We're writing them for, 40-something countries around the world that have adopted the GIPS standards, and they have very different levels of sophistication, very different types of resources, and so you got to be too careful you don't ask for too much, because you don't want to set the bar so high that firms think it's too hard to comply, and then they don't comply. So you have to try to figure out what's that right balance.
generally within our firm, we have included the compliant presentation in our sales books. So it's pretty standard for us to just, provide it readily without trying to, qualify a prospect necessarily. So that's one of the things we do.
Yeah, I would always recommend doing that. Just have standard Appendix A where you don't get the option of deleting it. It has to be, the GIPS information that's required to be presented. And then if you do that, then you just covered your bases.
So the objection I get to that is I don't know what strategy this client belongs in yet. Should it be my 60-40 composite? Should it be my 100% equity? Should it be all fixed income? I won't know until I have several meetings.
Right, so they wouldn't be, under this definition, they wouldn't qualify as a prospective client yet, because they have to be interested in a particular strategy. So I think, all of these things are facts and circumstances dependent, and it's possible that you go from, interested party to prospective client to client within the course of an hour, right? I mean, theoretically, it could happen. And so, yeah, I don't think the rules are meant to put you in a box or in a bind in some of those kind of rare circumstances. But the idea is to get this good information to prospective clients so they can make an informed decision.
I just think it's hard to include it in the pitch book if you don't know which.
You can include all of them. You can. I've seen.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen. You can probably make a reasonable guess as to, a selection that might be right.
60/40 is going to be your standard kind of work.
Sure. Sure.
Question?
I just had a question about, because I know I can't remember, this is sort of vague recollections for me, on applicability of. You mentioned that it has to be somebody who's eligible to be in that composite. So if you've had a product that's been out there for years, let's say, and you're marketing it to, institutional, 10 million or more, and now you're breaking it out into your retail world, and you're talking about million, 500 to a million, let's say. This is not the composite for them. They will never be eligible. We have arguments about whether you can show them that composite or not. And I always go with no, but I don't know that if you're talking about, well, I can send out a pitch book and I can put all the compliant things behind them. I could put all of them in there. See what we've got. See which one works for you. None of them might, but I don't know that yet. So which is the right answer?
Be happy to talk to you about that offline, but I think you don't want to get into a situation where, for example, you're offering a hedge fund to accredited investors. You don't want to be showing that to non-accredited investors, and so that's what we're trying to get around. And so it depends on how your composites are defined. If you say we don't take clients under $10 million. Then it wouldn't be appropriate to be showing that to a $1 million client. But if you have a composite that has those $10 million accounts, but also has some smaller ones, it's defined differently, then it could be appropriate.
Yeah, I think a lot would depend upon if you have a minimum asset size as
Yeah.
part of requirement for that composite.
Well, of course, the marketing people are like, but it's the closest thing we have. And it is, and as a layman, it is somewhat representative of what we would do for you. It's not going to be the same. The reason it's a $10 million limit is because we can do something differently. There's different trading costs, et cetera, blah, 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 versus a smaller account. And so when we slightly tweak the strategy for a different type of client, the marketing people want to show the closest thing we have and say that they'll talk around whatever it is. And my position is typically like, I'm just not sure that that's consistent with being GIPS compliant. And that's really what I'm trying to get to. I don't even know where I'm looking for that information. I went looking for it this week, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because I couldn't find what I was thinking of, but where it says you're supposed to provide it to people who are eligible. Is there the corollary, you're not supposed to provide it to those that are not?
There is a provision that recommends that you not provide a compliant presentation that has, or a composite information that has a composite minimum to somebody who has less money than the minimum. And we actually, in 2010, we started out with that as a requirement.
Where is that?
So it's the requirement, or,
The comment that you said.
The recommendation.
oh, it's a recommendation in the GIPS
In the
provisions,
standard.
in
Yeah.
section
Find it, yeah.
3,
So
0, maybe 0, I don't know. It's in one of the,
So
recommendations.
it's not a prohibition. You can show it to them because it's a
can.
recommendation.
Right.
And there are people, I'm aware of people who really do that. And on the fact that, look, people are going to start slow and hopefully they get more assets and they're going, plus it goes to the credibility of the portfolio manager.
Yeah, so I'd have 2 comments for you. First is I would challenge the notion that you need a composite minimum. I think a lot of firms have composite minimums. They think because they feel like,
An example, it's not the issue.
yeah, okay. So I would challenge that. And then second is, just to speak to your point, is, sometimes you have to think about, is it reasonable? And so think about how many times, for those of us that, manage wrap accounts, where you want to start a wrap strategy, but you want to use your institutional strategy. So, there's just no way that you manage a $10 million portfolio the same way you manage a $100,000 portfolio. You just don't. But if you think that it's reasonable and appropriate to show that performance, as a proxy for wrap accounts until you have them, I think you need to take a step back and think about that. So, and I'm not saying it is or isn't appropriate, but I think it can be done with proper disclosure. Did you?
Yeah. It's not-
I think that's really important too. Again, this overarching principle of not showing things that are false or misleading. Misleading in my eyes or in the eyes of the person who's receiving this information. It really should be in the eyes of the person that's receiving the information. So, yeah, I've always said that the sales and marketing folks can, the single largest threat to compliance that you'll face, but.
Feel the same way about us.
Well,
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it's really no different than what you have in the Advisors Act. And, the SEC's view is that as long as it's relevant to the potential client, you can present it. So if you believe it's relevant, it's really the same standard stated in actually a better way, so.
Yeah.
And I think Karen's right, that as long as you disclose that, if you're showing an institutional track record, that the minimum is generally higher, and you're showing it to a wrap fee, I think as long as you disclose that, that's important.
Yeah.
Okay, want to move on?
Yep.
Next slide.
Yes, please. So the next guidance statement was the benchmarks guidance statement. That was out for public comment. It just, that period ended in January. And what this guidance statement does is it really just consolidates all the guidance related to benchmarks that's scattered throughout lots of different places. There are a couple of key changes. One is a key proposed change is that if you have the option of benchmarks where one is gross of withholding taxes and one is net, that you need to use the one that is most comparable to your composite. So that's a new proposed requirement. And again, this was out for public comment. We're just still sorting through all the changes right now. There's clarification that if you do choose to include more than one benchmark in your compliant presentation, that all required information about that benchmark must be included for all benchmarks. And that's really like the key. Other than that, there really isn't too much, and the goal is to get this guidance statement finalized and issued in 2018.
The great thing about this guidance statement, having read it, it really goes into different type of benchmarks, and it's really helpful understanding, especially when your marketing people want to change different benchmarks to universes to peer groups. This does a very good job explaining that.
Yeah, I would say that while there's not much from a GIPS kind of requirement perspective, it's a fantastic paper.
It's like a white paper.
Yeah, and I highly encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't already. It's just very informative and I think useful as you approach benchmarking and those kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. And on to the favorite topic, the broadly distributed pooled funds guidance statement, which was issued last year. And the funds that this document applies to are those that are broadly distributed. In our world, it would be the retail funds or 40 Act funds, where there's typically no interaction between you and the end client. The funds that this also applies to are those where the firm has the ability to influence the marketing materials or the official fund offering documents. The goal of this document is to clarify that a prospective investor in a retail mutual fund does not need to receive a GIPS compliant presentation for that fund or for any specific composite. So, can you skip to the next one? There you go. So what this document does is it requires that 4 items be included in either fund marketing materials or offering documents that are intended for distribution to prospective investors. And it's really pretty simple. It's a description of the strategy, description of risks as required by regulators, if there are any, returns for the fund as required by regulation, assuming you are regulated, and then just making it clear what currency is used to express performance. So those are the 4 required items.
Question?
Was the intent here really more focused on usage since you kept really rather than RICS? Because for RICS, you were already doing all of this.
So it was really intended for all broadly distributed pooled funds, but what you said about you're already doing all of that is the critical point. So we're going to get to that in just 2 slides up. So could you just go to the next slide? So just clarification is just as far as those 4 required items go, which we all know, US RICS, you're already including those 4 items, at least in your offering documents, most offering documents, so you should be all set. The guidance goes on to say that if you are in a regulatory environment where they don't specify this information and you have to pick a return to present, you have to make sure that the returns you present are net of all fees and expenses. And those returns also shouldn't reflect the deduction of sales charges and loads, but if they do, you just have to disclose it. So, if you go to the next slide. But there is this concept that there's already a lot of regulatory environments that require these items already. So in the final document that was issued, this concept of safe harbor was included. And what it says is if you are in a regulatory environment that already requires those 4 items, and the CFA Institute is going to maintain a list of the regulatory environments that are include these 4 required items, and if that's the regulatory environment that applies to you, then you don't have to do anything with this guidance statement. You can just say, because we fall under safe harbor, we don't have to do anything. So that's the goal.
Is that list available? Because I'm assuming there's
That list,
jurisdictions other than the U.S.
yes. So that list is not yet available. So if you would just go to the next slide. The reason why it's not yet available is because the effective date has been changed. Originally, the effective date of this guidance statement was supposed to be January 1st, 2018, but it was decided that this is such a big deal that we should instead coordinate this and consolidate this with GIPS 2020. So the effective date was delayed to January 1st, 2020 to coordinate with GIPS 2020. So firms right now are encouraged to comply with this guidance if they want to and to apply it earlier, but they're not required to. If you just go to the next slide. So there are a couple other guidance statements that are also out that are on, or that were out recently on risk, overlay, and verifier independence. And those guidance statements have certain requirements embedded within them, as do these other 3 guidance statements that I just mentioned. So what is happening with all of these guidance statements is all of the requirements that look like they're going to move forward are going to be reflected in GIPS 2020. So even if we don't get, for example, the risk guidance statement issued immediately, you're going to see the key document or the key requirements that are embedded in that reflected in the GIPS 2020 exposure draft. So we're doing that with all of these documents. So what's happened is as we've gone through and to put all these requirements into the 2020 exposure draft, including the requirements in the broadly distributed guidance statement, we've realized that some changes are needed. So we are trying to figure out what's going to happen with all of these, and the best I can say right now is stand by. And in the not too distant future, hopefully we'll be letting you know what's happening with all of these documents, and particularly the broadly distributed pooled funds guidance statement. So that's it.
Okay, any questions for Karen on this? All right. Grace, you want to talk?
Yes.
She's going to give us the practical view. She's in the trenches like all you are every day, trying to figure this out, trying to explain it to the marketing people, trying to make sure everybody's in compliance. So she's the real trooper here. Tell us how you do it.
Okay. So thank you, Karen, for providing updates on the exposure drafts. And as you can see, there's actually going to be quite a few changes with sort of the GIPS standards with 2020, GIPS 2020 coming around the corner. I'm going to give you a disclaimer that the views that I'm presenting are actually my views, and they don't represent Franklin Templeton views. Before I start, I thought I would talk a little bit about Franklin Templeton Investments. We're a global investment management firm. We manage about $750 billion. We have a lot of different vehicles, from mutual funds, ETFs, fund of funds, private equity, wrap fee, you name it, we probably have it. We have 7 business entities within our group that actually claim GIPS compliance. 2 of them are verified. We actually have 5 other entities that don't claim GIPS compliance, but we actually create composites for those groups. So in terms of looking at our firm, we have grown over the years through acquisition or offering new products. So it's very, very challenging for us. Sometimes we have accounting systems that really don't talk to our main performance system. So anytime you look at regulatory changes globally, there are always constant changes when you look at from the KID documents to MiFID. But when there are changes with the GIPS standards, even the smallest changes can be a huge impact to our firm. So I'm going to be covering a little bit about exposure drafts and guidance statements and sort of how we kind of approach it. I'm going to start a little bit on exposure drafts. And I'm just curious, have anyone, have you actually responded back to the CFA Institute in regards to an exposure draft? Or has your firm actually responded back on an exposure draft? Oh.
Well, my only comment is, somebody over there raised their hand, is it's really helpful if you do that. They do listen, even though some people said in the pooled funds they didn't, but they do. And it's very, very helpful for them, because the industry is so complex, you can't address it all.
Right, and I think the CFA Institute does a really good job in terms of asking questions in regards to it. And I really encourage folks, if you haven't looked at an exposure draft, at least take a look at it. Whether you're GIPS compliant or not GIPS compliant, I would really encourage you to review it, because it's the only opportunity for firms to provide feedback. Because once a guidance statement becomes a guidance statement, there's really no turning back at that point. So going to the next slide. So one of the things that we look at in terms of an exposure draft is just looking at it very closely in terms of what are the shoulds, which are recommendations, versus what are the musts, which are the requirements. So we do review it carefully. We actually share the exposure draft with other groups because sometimes we want feedback from other groups in terms of what their thoughts are. We're not like the expert on every single vehicle that's out there. So we do share the exposure draft with other groups. So for the requirements, we actually look through and we look at how difficult is it for your firm to carry out, especially the new proposed requirements. Some of the things we look at are there any things that they're proposing that could affect your different systems? And when you look at the different systems that you have, it could impact like your marketing materials, or it could impact a compliant presentation, particularly if you have to add a specific column to a compliant presentation. That could be a systems change that really kind of impacts you. Then you can also look at potential manual processes that are being proposed. Generally, we don't like manual processes because they can be prone to error. You might need additional resources to actually review the data, and it's not very scalable. So as you kind of add new products, for example, and they have these requirements, then it makes it very hard if you're doing it manually. You might need additional resources in order to do that. One of the things that we have actually done with some of the exposure drafts, if your firm is not interested in actually writing comments back, you can always work with the IAA group. Paul Glenn is a great resource, and they have actually can help draft a letter based on your comments. But if you do pursue writing comments back to the CFA Institute, it's really good if you can respond back to the questions that are asked in an exposure draft. Those are really kind of thoughts that the CFA Institute may not be that sure about. Then you can also offer any suggestions. A lot of times You don't want to just say you don't like a new requirement. What's important is you indicate why you don't like the requirement, because otherwise the CFA Institute will have no idea in terms of, well, we want to include it, but we have no idea why.
Yeah, and I think if you have an alternate, suggestion for saying, well, think about doing something else, if you give a suggestion, that's so helpful. So I can't stress how important that is.
I was just going to add too, we talk about CFA Institute, and I no longer work there, but I once did. And it's CFA Institute is a membership organization, and so it's not just a couple of wonks sitting in a office somewhere trying to come up with these crazy rules. It's done through committees of volunteers, of practitioners, and so it's all of these things are done in conjunction with volunteers, and so these are industry standards. They're your standards. They're our standards. And so it's really important for you to participate in that. There's lots of opportunities to volunteer on the various committees as well. But providing that responses to consultation papers is really, really important.
Yes. And then other things you can do in regards to responding back to a comment letter is really kind of indicate if there's any conflicts with local regulations. I think that's helpful for the CFA Institute to know that there are, especially if it's something in the U.S. that it may conflict with. And also provide any other comments that could be special to you in terms of your firm, or perhaps the industry. And I think those are comments that would help. And the most important thing is, if there's any new requirements, can you actually meet these changes by the effective date? Because if you can't, then I think it's good to point out those reasons to the CFA Institute, and hopefully they can relax the effective date. Okay, next slide. Impact assessments just for new guidance statements coming out. It's very similar to the exposure draft, where you just really kind of want to look at, are there any conflicts with regulations which you might want to point out in your policies and procedures? But other things that you might want to look at is what is it really impacting, all these new requirements? Is it impacting the compliant presentation, your marketing materials? If there's any systems changes, kind of keep in mind that it could affect your marketing materials, particularly if they're automated. Are there policy and procedure changes that could be impacted? And definitely engage other teams. Like, for example, if it's impacting the marketing groups, you want to engage them early. Because like in our firm, we have thousands of materials that we have to modify. So really kind of engage the groups as early as possible. Next slide. And just to give you a few examples of some of the things that we have done in regards to the exposure draft, on the supplemental information, which Karen just kind of went through, we see it as impacting really kind of our marketing materials, as well as kind of the compliant presentation. When we look at the theoretical performance, this is something that's completely new, and we're happy to kind of see some basic foundational disclosure requirements in regards to that. Our RFP team and our marketing team actually sometimes want to use theoretical performance. It's not something we want to encourage because there's a larger potential liability in showing it. So we're glad that the CFA Institute is really kind of looking, in terms of providing some guidance in regards to it. Another example, and just taking a look at a couple of guidance statements that really kind of came out. I chose the error correction, which really came out back in 2010. But this really actually had a huge impact to our groups, and it had a huge impact to a lot of different groups, like our marketing groups. But when it came out, we really have to look through our current policies and procedures, like even with our accounting group, because there are times when our accounting group would actually process all of these revisions. And it was like, okay, well, how are we going to adopt this error correction? It also made us think about the thresholds and whether we were setting reasonable thresholds in terms of looking at error correction. We also had to develop sort of error correction testing. It's actually done on Excel using those particular thresholds. So when we look at error correction, it really impacted exactly how we did things within our group. And it can be very challenging. Our marketing groups had to start tracking the compliant presentations that were given out in case there was a material error. You would have to provide the corrected compliant presentation. And I think within our team ourselves, we actually started our own tracking. And we kind of went through, okay, let's look at the decision-making process that we make when we do have an error, and also be able to track the process that we went through with the marketing groups and other groups that might have distributed the compliant presentation. So it really kind of changed how our procedures and our policies in regards to that.
Let me add something for this error correction. This is, on one hand, this is a great safe harbor for the industry. On the other hand, it's a very dangerous thing for the industry, the way the SEC uses this. It's great for the industry because if you've had if you claim GIPS compliance, you have an error, you comply with your policy, you correct it, they're not going to come back and say you violated GIPS, therefore you violated the anti-fraud provisions. Where it's a danger if you have other divisions or units or affiliated advisors don't claim GIPS compliance, they're errors. I've been in situations where the SEC said, you had an error there, you didn't correct it, how could you not correct it when in your GIPS firm you had an error, you would have had to correct it. And I've also seen them apply that to the mutual fund world. So you just have to make sure you just because it's not in the GIPS firm, you really have to be sensitive to how you correct an error.
That's a good comment. Thank you. Okay, taking a look at the next slide, pooled funds guidance statement. This has an effective date of January 1st, 2020, and we were really glad that the effective date was really kind of moved. And we really felt that it affected marketing materials as well as our legal group. The legal group who really takes charge of a lot of the official documents that, for each of the different countries. But the marketing materials was really our biggest concern because if the official documents does not meet doesn't have the 4 requirements that Karen went through, then basically we had to go through our marketing materials, which means it's a huge inventory that we actually had to go through. We have over 13,000 fact sheets, and this is where, this is one small change that really kind of impacted the fact that, well, in some countries that were marketing this, the official documents do meet the requirements, but in other countries, they may not. And so it really had a huge impact to us in terms of really kind of meeting these requirements. But, when you look at our fact sheets, they are printed in different currencies, in different languages, and so it is a huge challenge for us. But it is important when these guidance statements do come out that, you are proactive in terms of reviewing it, as well as making sure that, you're still in compliance. And with a lot of the exposure drafts that are due to come out, it is really important to go through them as they come out. Okay, next slide. We've talked a lot about the exposure drafts and guidance statements, but as a GIPS compliant firm, you do have to meet the requirements of the standards. There's a huge handbook. I don't know, it's about, 300 pages? 500. Oh, Karen knows that. And then there's also the GIPS Q&A, it's the question and answer database. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I have the GIPS website listed on the next slide. But going to the next slide, we are looking, there's a huge, tremendous amount of resources within the GIPS website. I listed only a handful of them. There's a lot of white papers. It's not all about just guidance statements or exposure drafts, but there's a lot of helpful resources that are there. I've indicated their website. There's also the GIPS help desk. If you have questions, the help desk is supposed to respond to your questions in a timely manner. And you can also contact Paul Glenn at the IAA. He's sort of the GIPS guru within IAA, so you can always contact him with questions too. And if your firm is actually verified, I would highly suggest you work with your verifier, because they are a really good resource. And when you're paying significant dollars for your verifier, they're more than pleased to really kind of help you.
Grace, thank you very much. Jonathan, you've been uncharacteristically quiet. What you've been through this? You've been through all these changes. You've been responsible and overseeing, a lot of the guidance statements, interpretations. What advice can you give to the audience here? These people all the time trying to figure out GIPS, making sure they're not missing anything. We know how technical it can be. What do you see? What advice could you give them?
Yeah, I would just say, just pay attention to the things that are coming out. There's a wonderful resource in the GIPS newsletter that you can sign up for that highlights any new Q&As that are issued or guidance that's being issued. Provide feedback on that. We're all busy. We're all busy people, but it really makes a huge difference in providing feedback, and all of that is considered very heavily and influences what the final rules are. I think there's nothing in the GIPS standards that is trying to trip you up. I think really it just gets back to presenting performance in a fair way, and so I think what we've tried to do is try to tighten it up so that things are clear and consistent, at least through my tenure there, and really try to address needs that are expressed by the industry. Again, these are industry standards, and so if you're having issues with error correction, for example, that's why we developed the error correction guidance statement, or whatever it may be, and so get involved, have your voice heard. There was mention of model performance or theoretical performance, and I wrote a paper with a colleague at State Street on model performance, still while I was at CFA Institute, but it hasn't been circulated real widely. So we put together some best practices for developing or presenting and managing model performance, and you can find that on my website. I'm not sure how easily you can find it on the GIPS or CFA Institute website, but you can look there if you're interested in that kind of stuff, or reach out. Happy to talk to you about that. I think the biggest takeaway is that there's nobody sitting trying to come up with rules to make your life miserable. It's really based on the questions and feedback and things that we or they now see and hear. So yeah.
Well, I have 2 more minutes, or any questions from the audience?
Are you hearing from, in the kind of post-F squared, where some of these, advisors that were gatekeepers to other advisors, them moving or insisting that, end advisors that they hire for their clients go through a GIPS process to try to, in their minds at least, decrease the risk of something like that happening?
Yes, I am. F squared, at least for the SEC, is the gift that keeps giving to them. I assume most people are familiar with F squared. What that really has done is caused advisors that are hiring sub-advisors to bolster their due diligence. And one of the things they're doing is requiring the sub-advisor to be not only GIPS compliance but verified. And there are limitations of verification, but the nice thing is more due diligence. And they're all asking them to make sure that they certify they have the records, those records are available to the hiring manager, and the performance they give is accurate, and if they comply with GIPS, compliance with GIPS. And even more important, because I think this is going to trip up the industry, if any of that performance is related to a portability event, they comply both with the GIPS and the SC portability requirements. And I'm seeing the SEC focus on that right now. You may have hiring a sub-advisor, and 5 years ago, they had a change in the portfolio management team. GIPS would say you go back to the history of that strategy. SEC takes a different view, go back just to when that team changed. You can use like the 5 years. So you got to be very careful about that.
And I would just mention too that while I was at CFA Institute, I spent a lot of my time doing training for the SEC. So we went to all the different regional offices and trained all the examiners and some of the enforcement folks too, just on on some of the basics of not only GIPS but performance and some other things. So hopefully you're encountering people that are asking better questions. But the big thing that I always imposed or tried to impress on them is to where to go to get answers. They don't have to be experts on everything, but know where to go to get that information.
Well, our time is out. All I have to say, you all owe a lot to this panel. This panel makes sure you are employed, and you're going to be very busy for the next couple of years. So thank you very much. Give a hand out to the panel here.